Through the 90s, I had seen the Batman from my childhood grow older film by film, and in 2005, it was time for a new generation to have its own Batman. A young Batman who would appeal to new sensibilities, a Batman who was going to take and leave some characteristics specific to the one who had preceded him, and therefore whom I would like sometimes and dislike at others. Critics tend to think of The Dark Knight as the highlight of Nolan's trilogy. That's why my next video will aim to balance things out a bit by pointing out some flaws that prevent me from considering it to be as good as Burton's Duology or Mask of the Phantasm. But before I talk about The Dark Knight, I'm going to talk about Batman Begins, my favorite in the Nolan trilogy. While we no longer expected anything from Batman in the movies after the disastrous Batman and Robin, it must be said that we were not yet as accustomed to reboots as today. It's the film that was tasked to reinvent the character and his universe, and by doing so, it imposed a new canon for the fans who would now compare every other Batman movie to it. But what happens when you compare the cinematic canon to the canon of the comics? Welcome to Frank Movie Talks, I'm Frank, and today I'm going to explore Batman Begins. What is Batman Begins? Batman Begins is basically two movies. The first half is inspired by a comic called The Man Who Falls, in which, as the title suggests, we find the theme of the fall that often comes up in the film and where we see Bruce traveling around the world to undergo the training of several mentors, such as a martial arts master who lives in a monastery in Korea and the French bounty hunter Henri Ducart, with whom Bruce gets into an argument when he sees him commit a murder. As for the second half, it takes up several elements of Batman Year One, a comic told from both Gordon and Bruce's point of view as the latter returns from his trip around the world and becomes Batman to fight corruption in Gotham.
You've eaten well. You've eaten Gotham's wealth, its spirit, but your feast is nearly over. From this moment on, none of you are safe.
It's certainly his kinship with Batman Year One that makes Batman Begins the first film to correctly represent Gordon after Tim Burton made him a complicated ally not very present in the plot, and Joel Schumacher turned him into Chief O'Hara.
Well, if I only had a nickel for every time he's baffled us.
In addition to Gordon, Batman Begins also puts forward Alfred, who, like Adrian, always has the right word to cheer up Bruce, and Lucius Fox, who, like Q, always has the right gadget to expand Batman's arsenal. The first apparent problem with Batman Begins is that by presenting itself as the definitive origin of Batman for the movies, it quickly becomes strange that Bruce Wayne's trip around the world boils down to a stay in Orient and a ninja training, since Batman is much more than a ninja. Besides, we don't call him the best ninja in the world, we call him the best detective in the world. As critics have so often mentioned, Nolan was on a mission to make the Batman universe as realistic as possible, so it would have made sense to show the other skills Bruce has accumulated over the course of his trip and the other countries he has passed through, either by dedicating an entire movie to it and showing Bruce Wayne returning to Gotham only at the end, or by also employing flashbacks in the sequels to show how Bruce became a detective, an engineer, and a scientist. But in this universe, we just made Batman a ninja, and that's why we only showed him in the Orient. The Orient is also the ideal destination to tell the mystical transformation of a white man.
You are one. I can see it in your eyes. You're more one than anyone.
If we are to believe Hollywood, this is where we have to go if we want to train both our body and our mind, especially when what we're looking for is really inside of us, but we still have the budget to shoot exotic sets. However, while Batman Begins, and ultimately the entire trilogy, did not show everything Bruce had to learn to become Batman, it spends a lot of time on the subject without really saying much more than what Tim Burton had shown with a set and Joel Schumacher had shown with a flashback. Decisions that allowed these two filmmakers to explore the complexity of Batman himself instead of how to become him. What interests Nolan and screenwriter David S. Goyer and monopolizes an entire hour of their movie is how an ordinary man becomes Batman, while treating the subject like a vulgar grocery list. The film takes an hour to explain to us that Bruce is afraid of bats, that Bruce is sad that his parents were killed in an alley, that Bruce wants revenge, that Bruce goes traveling, that Bruce learns how to become a ninja, and so on. But I repeat, without us learning anything new about Bruce Wayne than what the other films told us in fewer words. The truth is, despite all his talent, Nolan is not particularly good at doing what we call show don't tell. In other words, despite being a visually very creative director, he rarely uses this talent to convey information or emotions, instead resorting to dialogues loaded with exposition.
Where is it?
The clean slate? Where you type in someone's name, date of birth, in a few minutes they're gone from every database on Earth. Sound a little too good to be true?
You're lying! Breaking data took it to prototype stage.
and through which the characters even go so far as to explain who they are rather than demonstrating it.
It's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me.
Bruce?
A bad habit that forces Nolan to sacrifice theatricality
Theatricality and deception are powerful agents.
for even more explications. So we end up with scenes that should look like this, but which look like this.
Flesh is bad again, sir. They nest somewhere in the ground.
And this lack of theatricality becomes even more noticeable when we compare Batman Begins to the film that inspired it.
Pinch again. And this'll all be mine?
Everything.
Run away and never return.
Bruce. Why do we fall?
Simba?
It's a joke, Batman Begins is not based on The Lion King, but it is truly based by Goyer's own admission on another film released the same year as The Lion King.
After the war, when you disappeared for some 7 years. You've been gone 7 years.
I'm Batman.
Somebody's planning to disperse the toxin using the water supply.
Water supply won't help you disperse an inhaler.
What?
Unless you have a microwave emitter powerful enough to vaporize all the water in the mains. A microwave emitter like the one Wayne Enterprise is just misplaced.
You're a fool, Claymore.
Dr. Crane isn't here right now. But if you'd like to make an appointment.
Every time a civilization reaches the pinnacle of its decadence, we return to restore the balance.
Hey, that's the US of A you're talking about, pal.
I am talking about ruling the world.
Luckily, Batman Begins makes up for its lack of theatricality with a solid thematic structure. Indeed, in the second half of the film, we see Batman climbing 3 ranks of criminals: a realistic mobster, a supervillain worthy of facing a superhero, and a terrorist. I'll be talking more about the impact of the 9/11 attacks in the next episode. For now, the bottom line is that these 3 adversaries are linked to Batman by a very specific theme: fear.
That's the power of fear.
I'm probably not very frightening to a guy like you with these crazies. You can't stand it.
And the word is panic.
At first glance, the film appears to have taken Ra's al Ghul and Scarecrow from a repertoire of minor opponents that had been forgotten from the last 4 films. But in truth, this is an effective combination and a clever selection to tell the story of Batman's beginnings, since the film makes Falcone and Scarecrow the representatives of fear that Batman must defeat to claim and monopolize this dangerous power.
Why bats lost away?
That's frightened me. This time my enemies shared my dread.
As for Ra's al Ghul, he's his former mentor who is secretly pulling the strings of the 2 villains previously named. Despite its flaws, what Batman Begins has been able to offer to those who have never read a Batman comic before is an exposition to various elements of his mythology that had not been shown in the other films released until now, or on which they didn't emphasize it enough. The film ends with an exciting promise.
I thought this might be a good opportunity for improving the foundations.
In the southeast corner.
Precisely, sir.
Was this promise fulfilled? Subscribe to the channel to find out. I hope you liked this episode. Please take the time to like it, share it, leave a comment, it truly helps. And see you next time.